It was my sin that held him there until it was accomplished. His dying breath has brought me life. I know that it is finished.
Thanks for joining us on Mission 66, your connection to the Bible teaching of TWR in partnership with Dr. Luis Sayao. Today, we're in the book of Ruth, which offers timeless lessons in how ordinary people, through faith and obedience, can play a part in God's greater purpose. Download the free study guide at mission66.org. As we begin, ask God to open your heart to His Word. Now here's Esther to get us started.
Welcome to the continuation of our journey in the Bible, where we're in a series on the book of Ruth, and this is found in the Old Testament. Now, everybody loves a good love story, right? Well, today we'll see a Bible love story that is far more than just a love story. And if you're still looking or waiting for that Prince Charming or that princess to come into your life, my advice, friend, is commit the whole thing to God because He knows how to arrange the entire meeting. God may not always act on our timetable, but hey, He never fails. Well, today we'll be discussing Ruth chapter 3 with our teacher, John Matthews, and he presents the theme, Romeo and Juliet.
Esther, thank you very much. Very warm welcome to Mission 66. Wherever you join us from today, it is so good to have your company and so good to be with you. And you know, friends, in our journey through the book of Judges, we heard a lot about some pretty awful human behavior and some terrible times, things that were actually not very easy to talk about. But today we arrive here at the third chapter of Ruth, and there's a different feeling in the air, an air of goodness and mercy and hope. Do you know, it's almost like the Lord saw that we needed perhaps some refreshing. And so here we are. We pick up the story of Ruth when she had married one of the sons of Naomi and Elimelech, who were journeying through the country of Moab to escape famine back home. But in the course of time, Naomi's husband Elimelech dies, and then so do both of Naomi's sons. But they'd married Moabite women. These two women were called Orpah and Ruth. Orpah, grief-stricken, decided to return back home and begin life over again in familiar territory. But Ruth makes the unexpected decision to stick by her mother-in-law no matter what befell them, and to adopt Naomi's God as her own. And God honors Ruth's commitment and so arranges for her to be able to glean grain from the fields of a man, and his name was Boaz. And Boaz, as it turns out, was a relative of Naomi's and was able to act as a kinsman-redeemer. Now what does that mean? Well, that is a relative who is tasked with taking care of relatives who are in trouble. And Boaz treats Ruth kindly and ensures that she's going to be safe in his field. And day after day, Ruth gathers enough grain to abundantly provide for both herself and Naomi. And perhaps we've been just discerning throughout this story so far that there's a little romance in the air, perhaps, between Ruth and Boaz. Well, let's see what happens as we get to chapter 3, starting in verse 1. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to Ruth, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash, therefore, and anoint yourself. Put on your cloak and go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known until the man has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies, then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." And she replied, All that you say, I will do. So if you like, Naomi is kind of playing matchmaker here for Boaz and Ruth, but she's also aware of the customs of the day. So they didn't do this sort of thing in Moab. So Ruth has to trust that Naomi knows exactly what she's talking about. So here you have harvest time, which is a time for celebration on the threshing floor. And in this moment of happy festivity, Ruth receives her mother-in-law's advice to respond to the special attention that Boaz had already shown her. And we have to know that there was nothing immoral in the instructions that Naomi had just given Ruth. This was just the way it was done in Israel, and it's a symbolic way of asking for the kinsman-redeemer's care and protection. Verse 6. So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. And then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight, the man was startled. He turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. And he said, Who are you? And she answered, I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. And he said, May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And this was the way that a woman would respectfully ask the guy, in effect, to marry her. The term she uses is spreading your wings, and Boaz, being an older man, well, he would have been, you'd imagine, pretty shy about asking this young lady from Moab to marry him. But from Ruth's standpoint, well, she needed to press the matter because time was passing. But the way that Naomi told her to proceed with this was pure and makes for a lovely romantic touch. And Boaz graciously consents because he's known Ruth long enough to know her character. And he reveals how even the townspeople all testify that she's a worthy soul, even though she was from the land considered to be enemy territory, Moab. And so the word had gotten around about Ruth, and we are seeing a story, a love story really, in the making. Verse 12. And now it is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning. So Boaz here acts to all fine form, really. He reveals that there's another relative of Naomi's who's more closely related than he was. So the other close relative had to be given a chance to speak for Ruth first, even though he knew very well this other guy may well claim Naomi's property and acquire Ruth as his wife as part of this bargain. But Boaz is yet willing to give that man a chance to break his heart and take Ruth. Perhaps he's secretly hoping and even expecting that the other relative might refuse to involve himself with a woman from Moab, and that may give Boaz a clear path to marrying this lovely lady. Verse 14. So she lay at his feet until the morning, but she arose before one could recognize another, and he said, Let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. And Boaz says this to protect her from any gossip that may arise about this. And even as the day dawns, he's thinking more of her than of himself. Verse 15 says, And he said, Bring the garment you are wearing and hold it out. So she held it, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her. And then she went into the city, and when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, "How did you fare, my daughter?" And then she told her all that this man had done for her, saying, "These 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said to me, 'You must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law.'" And she replied, "Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out. For the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today." And so Naomi senses this spark between the pair, and she knows that Boaz would take care of this business efficiently and immediately. And we're going to have to wait, actually, until next time when we get to Ruth chapter 4 to see what happens.
Well, John, I guess you're leaving us on a cliffhanger there, but we will wait patiently for this next episode. Well, this, my friends, is Mission 66. I'm Esther, and I have to tell you, I'm enjoying this. I'm really taking it in. And we're with our teacher, John Matthews, and I love this book because it's so lighthearted, and I think it's far more lighthearted than some of the dark themes that we've read about in the book of Judges. Nonetheless, if anyone, John, is listening to us or just joining us, and perhaps they may have missed this entire storyline, do you think that you could just briefly retell what's been happening in the book of Ruth?
Yeah, sure. Look, I mean, here we see God's blessings, don't we, starting to unfold in the lives of Ruth and Naomi. And Naomi was somebody who had very recently experienced not only the death of her husband, but the death of both of her sons. But she's beginning to see here signs of, I suppose, for want of a better expression, her fortunes being restored as she returns home to Judah, because she comes across this guy called Boaz, who's a man of good character and great standing, and he recognizes Ruth's virtuous qualities, and so he treats her really kindly. And Naomi, the mother-in-law, picks up on this fact that he may well be interested in Ruth, but that he may also be pretty shy about approaching her romantically. And so Naomi suggests to Ruth that she take the first step, and to do it in such a way that is acceptable within the cultural norms. And so Ruth's decision to approach Boaz shows her wisdom and maturity, and instead of seeking somebody younger or wealthier, which she could easily have done, she chooses the person who's most appropriate, as guided by Naomi, her mother-in-law, and indeed the traditions of her people. And when Naomi realizes that Boaz qualifies as a kinsman-redeemer, well, then she sets up this secret meeting at the threshing floor, and Boaz then expresses his willingness to take on the role of guardian redeemer, which would involve marrying Ruth and preserving the family name of Naomi's late husband and sons. And so we're moving forward, aren't we, with the story towards a resolution, and God is orchestrating events for Ruth and Naomi's redemption, and we'll see what happens next in the next episode of Mission 66.
You know, I'm really curious about your thoughts on this. Do you perhaps think that Ruth was being just a little too forward with Boaz here in this situation?
Well, Esther, Ruth certainly seems to approach Boaz pretty boldly, maybe even going beyond actually Naomi's advice. And what she did, it may have been perceived negatively by others. Hence Boaz's response, I think, when he says, look, it's better that nobody knows that you're here. Perhaps the appearance of something wrong, just in case. And Ruth approaches him really with the intention of marriage, and she makes those intentions pretty plain. Yet despite their interaction, the texts suggest no immoral behavior from either Boaz or Ruth. On the contrary, there's a purity about the story. Let's say she takes then this bold step, but she does it purely towards Boaz. And we've also got to work in, as often is the way, some space for cultural context here. The reality is, this was a world very different from ours, wherever we are listening to Mission 66 today.
All right, well, let's speak about the customs, because in verse 9, it mentions this act of spreading the cloak. So what exactly does this expression mean in this context?
Well, the act of spreading the cloak symbolizes protection and covering. It's a gesture suggesting that Ruth is clearly asking Boaz to marry her because he's a kinsman-redeemer. And Ruth's boldness, it may have been reflective of her Moabite background. The Moabites were known to have a more permissive approach to close relationships, but to her credit, Ruth is willing to abide by the law of the Hebrews and indeed follow Naomi's instructions.
Yeah, she's a very wise woman, isn't she? Well, verse 12 mentions another redeemer, someone who is a much closer relative and who, hasn't been mentioned before. So why didn't Naomi bring this up a lot earlier?
Well, I think she may well not have known, Esther. It's actually Boaz who knows that there is a relative that's closer than himself. And even if Naomi did know about the other relative, she mightn't have had any expectation that anyone else would step up. Ruth was a foreigner, and anyone who didn't know her personally may have been scared off at the prospect of marrying this stranger from enemy territory. And according to the law of the kinsman-redeemer, a widow such as Ruth should be taken by the closest relative of her deceased husband. And this would have been the son of Naomi. And we see that, don't we, when we go back to Leviticus 25, that when a man dies, it says in the Mosaic law, his brother should marry the widow. If there's no brother, then the next closest male relative, perhaps a cousin or whatever it is, should do it. So within the family's lineage, someone else had the first right, and it was the reason for this was for the preservation of the property of the deceased man, as well as to ensure that the family line was preserved. But these were the times of the judges when people really had come to care very little for the law. And so perhaps all the more impressive that Boaz reveals his virtue by knowing and indeed acting upon what was written in Leviticus.
It may be that perhaps Ruth, wouldn't have been a desirable match for everyone. And I say this because as humans, we have a way of looking and perhaps judging people from an outward perspective as opposed to considering their hearts. And in this context, there may have been other women who may have possessed qualities that were more sought after, like being young and wealthy and attractive, even available.
Yeah. No, it's a good point. But I think one thing that we're learning pretty quickly about Boaz is, in terms of his dealings throughout this story, is that he's a man of integrity. He's a man of depth. He's a man of God. And so he sees Ruth as a good choice, and he recognizes integrity, love, and virtue in her.
This is really teaching us to go deep and to look deep. A very great conversation here, John. Now, speaking of the kinsman-redeemer, there may be a parallel, right, between Leviticus 25 and the coming of Christ, who, of course, we know as our Redeemer.
Yeah, absolutely. And because we are sinners, let's bring it right back to our lives and our situations today where we are listening to Mission 66, because that's what the Bible does. It always applies the then to the now. And we are sinners, and we're lost in sin. We're destitute, whether we realize it or not. Ruth realized it. And Jesus then effectively buys us back with his own blood shed on the cross. I've often heard the question posed, well, who killed Jesus? Sometimes the Jews are blamed because the scribes and the Pharisees conspired to stir the crowd up, mob psychology, you know what that's like. But they weren't the ones who actually killed Jesus. The Roman occupiers, well, they wouldn't allow the Jews to execute anybody, not even convicted criminals. That right was reserved for the Roman authorities, Pontius Pilate was in a position where he could have set Jesus free, but he didn't. He ordered the execution to take place in order to please the crowd and avoid a riot. But Pilate and the foot soldiers who had to drive those nails into the hands of Jesus, even they weren't actually the ones who killed Jesus. To find the real culprit, you've got to go back to eternity past, when it was written, "The soul that sins shall die." And if we have sinned, the death sentence is upon each one of us. But God, who is all-knowing and all-loving, finds a way to redeem sinful mankind. And that way was to send his only Son, Jesus, into the world to live a sinless life. And at the end of that perfection, he allows himself to be crucified as the sacrificial payment for the sin which he was not guilty of himself. And as somebody who was perfect, the only perfect person who ever lived, he was the only one qualified to do that. And that's why the Bible calls Jesus the Lamb of God, who was slain from the foundations of the world. In the words of Stuart Townend's song, "Behold the man upon a cross, my sin upon his shoulders. Ashamed, I hear my mocking voice call out among the scoffers. It was my sin that held him there until it was accomplished. His dying breath has brought me life. I know that it is finished."
John, do you think that it could be said that God is the one who killed Jesus Christ?
Well, don't forget that God the Father, Jesus the Son, and the Holy Spirit are all equally God. And it was God's triune love for fallen humanity and Jesus' willingness to sacrifice himself that paved the way to the horror and indeed the glory of the Son of God taking the Father's wrath and punishment for the sins of the world that put Jesus on that cross. And he's compelled by our lost condition to launch the greatest rescue operation that the world has ever and will ever see. But he did it only because someone needed to be rescued. And that someone was you and I. And so we put him there. I put him there. You put him there.
We all put him there, John. We all did, yeah.
You're quite right, Esther. But do you know what the most magnificent, unspeakable thing is about God's love? Is that even if you or I were the only one in the history of the human race who were in need of salvation, Jesus would still have agreed to be born as a human and lived a sinless life and died on that brutal cross for that one person, you or I. Even if you were the only one who ever sinned, Jesus would have come and died on that cross for you and you alone. You see, that is the gospel. We owe him everything, and he will provide for us who trust in him, who accept his offer of forgiveness and salvation. He will provide for us an eternity of glory and love.
And this is why what Jesus Christ did on the cross for us is the quintessential love story. I mean, it really is far more touching than the love story between Ruth and Naomi.
Yeah, it sure is. It sure is. But there's that Lovely reflection, Esther, of that greatest love story within this one, isn't there? Because you have Naomi who begins out broken, without hope. And one of the important things to say is that she recognizes that. How could you not, you might say? Look at her circumstances. But in many ways, we are no less in despair and no less in need. But yet so often we don't recognize it. And she, Naomi, laments that God had made her life bitter and believed she had no future. God can handle that, by the way. He can handle our very worst, our very deepest cries. But as the story progresses, Naomi may have felt no hope, but she put one foot in front of the other and still kept following. And as she does, what happens? God does what God always does when we trust him. Not 90% of the time God will go before you and he'll bring a sense of peace and understand. No, 100% of the time. And in this story, God actually physically restores her fortunes, and he does it through a foreigner who's willing to say yes to Naomi's God. But God always, as he promises, is there for us. And God will always deliver us to that happy end if we trust in him.
Fantastic. Wow. I've truly been impacted by this incredible discussion, John. Thanks so much for your insights on Ruth and the kinsman-redeemer. And I'd like for us to move into the chapter summary so that we can take away what we've learned today.
Yeah, let's do that, Esther. You know, chapter 3 of this book of Ruth is describing the proper and heart-warming courtship between Ruth and Boaz. Ruth, we're learning, is an exceptional person. And Boaz, for his part, he's a man of great character. And Naomi, well, she picks up on Boaz's interest. And when Ruth returns with these 6 measures of barley, it's as if Boaz is saying, look, I'm with you. Let's handle the formalities and make sure no one else stands in the way. And if we can move forward and if it's the right thing, then we'll move forward. And seeing this, Naomi, who returns saying, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, bitterness. Here we see joy return. And she understands that this marriage will preserve her family's name and lineage. And she hopes indeed for the birth of a child to preserve her family household. And you know, I think the central truth of this passage is captured in a well-known phrase that goes like this: God delays, but he never fails. He never fails. God has blessing in store for Naomi and her family based on their faith. After so much suffering, loss, and hardship, being an immigrant from Moab, returning back in despair and grief, Naomi must have thought, I'm sure she did, God's forgotten me long time ago. What else is going to happen here? It's just a downward spiral. But no, the Lord ultimately reveals his kindness and he brings this blessing about. And his timing's always perfect. Perhaps you've experienced this in your own life. Remember, God may seem to us to delay, but he never fails. And if we're to boast in this life, let's be like people like Boaz and boast in Jesus Christ and him alone. And let me finish maybe with the final verse of that Town End song, because there's more. I will not boast in anything, no gifts, no power, no wisdom, but I will boast in Jesus Christ, his death and resurrection. Why should I gain from his reward? I can't give an answer, but this I know with all my heart. His wounds have paid my ransom.
Well, that is where we'll leave it for today, friends. What a fascinating journey through the book of Ruth. And hey, we invite you to join us next time so we can find out where this whole romance will lead. Well, look, We may be closing off the episode, but the conversation continues on Mission 66. That's our Facebook page and our Instagram page. Go ahead and leave your comment, your questions, or perhaps if you have some insights of your own, we'd love to get a look at that. Connect with us on Mission 66 on Facebook and on Instagram. So until next time, friend, God bless you.
As Mission 66 comes to a close, be sure to download your free study guide at mission66.org. Deepen your daily devotion with insights from each episode, and let John and Esther lead you through the scriptures. Get your study guide at mission66.org and be prepared for our next episode. There, you can also connect with us, ask questions, or donate to help Mission 66's worldwide outreach. Head to mission66.org. Mission 66 is made possible through Transworld Radio in partnership with Dr. Luis Sayao.